Tokyo Bay, April 7, 1945. The morning sun climbed above the Pacific horizon as 91 silver fighters sliced through the air toward Japan's sacred heartland. Major James B. Tapp felt the familiar weight of his flight stick, knowing that beneath his wings hung 6 Browning machine guns, each barrel fed with ammunition designed to pierce armor and ignite fuel. His P-51 Mustang carried between 1,880 and 2,800 rounds, depending on the variant. Early production models loaded 500 rounds into each inner gun and 270 into the outer positions, while later versions standardized on 400 rounds per inboard weapon for better mechanical reliability. The volcanic cone of Mount Fuji rose through the morning haze, its snow-draped summit catching the light. Throughout this mission, that sacred mountain would serve as a landmark for navigation, a fixed point in an alien landscape. The countryside below unfolded like a painted scroll, terraced rice paddies, clustered villages, and military complexes that had never witnessed American single-engine fighters in their skies. This sortie represented something unprecedented in military aviation. Escort fighters accompanying B-29 superfortresses into the heart of Japan from bases located 750 miles distant. Just 24 months earlier, such a concept would have been dismissed as fantasy by every strategic planner in uniform. The mathematics simply didn't work. Single-engine fighters couldn't fly that far. Except now they could.
As 7 o'clock arrived, Japanese interceptors swarmed upward, more than 100 fighters scrambling from airfields throughout the Kanto Plain. Through the scattered clouds came aircraft that struck Japanese pilots with visceral shock, land-based American fighters over Tokyo itself. Not Navy Hellcats launching from carriers with their limited combat radius, but Army Air Forces fighters that had somehow traversed 750 miles of open ocean to appear above the Imperial Palace. The defenders flew Japan's finest equipment, Nakajima K-84 Hayates, designated Frank by Allied intelligence, alongside aging K-43 Hayabusas, K-44 Shokis, K-61 Hiens, and Navy Mitsubishi A-6M Zeros and N-1K2J Shidens. The K-84 possessed capabilities that could, under ideal circumstances, match or exceed both the Mustang and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt in specific flight regimes. What unfolded in the sky that morning would expose the chasm between two nations' approaches to industrial warfare. The encounter would demonstrate why American factories had produced what combat pilots considered the definitive long-range interceptor of the Second World War.
The North American P-51D arrived in the Pacific Theater carrying a reputation forged over European battlefields. This aircraft had broken the Luftwaffe's back and enabled daylight precision bombing of the Third Reich, missions that had cost thousands of American lives before the Mustang's arrival. Originally designed for British export, the airframe had been transformed when British engineers mated it with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin power plant. That Anglo-American collaboration, American aerodynamic genius married to British engine technology, produced one of history's most successful warplanes. The marriage of the Merlin and the Mustang airframe culminated in the D variant, providing the United States Army Air Forces with a high-altitude, high-performance, extended-range fighter capable of escorting bomber formations to Berlin and returning safely. Now, incredibly, the same aircraft flew from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back again. Under the cowling sat a Packard V1650-7 engine, the license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66. This 12-cylinder liquid-cooled power plant generated 1,695 horsepower at takeoff with water methanol injection engaged, climbing to 1,720 horsepower when pilots engaged war emergency power settings. The two-stage, two-speed supercharger maintained robust performance at altitudes where Japanese radial engines struggled for breath, their single-stage superchargers unable to adequately compress the thin atmosphere. Performance figures told the story in numbers. Maximum velocity of approximately 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, a service ceiling approaching 42,000 feet, and those 6 wing-mounted 50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns. The mathematics of firepower were precisely calculated and devastating. 6 guns cycling at 800 rounds per minute each meant the P-51D delivered 4,800 rounds per minute, 80 projectiles every second. Each armor-piercing incendiary round carried 46 grams of mass and exited the muzzle at 2,900 feet per second, carrying tremendous kinetic energy capable of penetrating aircraft armor, detonating fuel tanks, and destroying engines with concentrated fire. By late 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter squadrons in the 8th Air Force had converted to Mustangs, testament to the aircraft's dominance over every available alternative. This wholesale adoption reflected American industrial capacity at flood tide. North American Aviation's assembly lines in California and Texas ran continuously, around the clock, every day of the week. At peak efficiency, a new Mustang emerged from the production floor every 60 minutes. By war's end, 15,586 P-51s of all types had been manufactured, with the D model accounting for 8,156 aircraft, exceeding Japan's total fighter production during the war's final 2 years.
The extraordinary range capability that brought Mustangs over Tokyo represented a fundamental revolution in fighter operations. With twin 110-gallon drop tanks mounted under the wings, Mustangs routinely flew round-trip missions of 1,500 statute miles, occasionally pushing to 1,600 miles when circumstances demanded. This equated to flying from Los Angeles to Little Rock, Arkansas, entirely over open ocean in a single-engine aircraft with no alternate landing sites except the Pacific itself. This achievement rested on the Merlin engine's exceptional fuel economy at cruise settings, consuming merely 65 gallons per hour at economical cruise power, combined with the P-51's revolutionary laminar flow wing design. That wing reduced aerodynamic drag by 35% compared to conventional airfoils. North American aerodynamicist Edgar Schmude had developed this revolutionary wing profile that maintained smooth airflow over a greater percentage of the wing surface, delaying the transition to turbulent flow and dramatically cutting parasitic drag. Standing in stark technological contrast was the Nakajima K-84 Hayate, which entered operational service with the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service during June 1944, too late and in insufficient numbers to alter the war's trajectory. Named Gale in Japanese and designated Frank by Allied intelligence, this fighter embodied Japan's desperate attempt to match American technological superiority with whatever resources remained to the collapsing empire. The K-84 earned recognition as Japan's finest fighter to see large-scale deployment, though large-scale was relative. What Japan considered mass production, America would classify as prototype quantities. On paper, the aircraft boasted impressive specifications, high velocity and exceptional maneuverability, armed with up to two 30mm HO-155 cannons and two 20mm HO-5 cannons that provided formidable striking power. Paper specifications, however, told only part of the story. The 30mm cannons carried just 50 rounds per gun, the 20mm weapons only 150 rounds each, yielding a total ammunition capacity of merely 400 rounds, compared to the Mustang's 1,880 to 2,800 rounds. The Nakajima HA-45 Homare 18-cylinder radio engine driving the K-84 was a complex machine featuring fuel injection and a single-stage 2-speed supercharger with water methanol injection, boosting output to a rated 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. Initial testing showed promise. Prototypes achieved 387 miles per hour in level flight, with later claims reaching 427 miles per hour under optimal conditions with high-octane fuel and perfect engine calibration. Reality painted a darker picture. Late-war Japanese production told a story of declining quality, desperate improvisation, and systemic collapse. Field units learned harsh lessons about the Hayate's temperamental Nakajima Homare engine and landing gear prone to catastrophic failure at the worst possible moments. The Homare, while theoretically powerful, suffered chronic reliability problems that worsened as quality control disintegrated. The engine demanded precise manufacturing tolerances that Japanese factories, under constant B-29 bombardment and lacking quality steel and aluminum, could no longer maintain. Many landing gear assemblies suffered from inadequate heat treatment of late-war Japanese steel, contaminated with impurities that prevented proper hardening. Consequently, numerous Hayates experienced strut collapses during landing, writing off aircraft Japan couldn't afford to lose and killing pilots who took months to train. This disparity in production quality reflected the broader industrial catastrophe facing Japan, a nation that had wagered everything on a swift war and lost. While American factories maintained consistent quality despite massive production volumes and actually improved standards as manufacturing techniques evolved, Japanese production deteriorated precipitously. Progressive quality control breakdown meant pilots never knew how individual aircraft would perform, whether brakes would function, whether engines would hold together under high power, or whether they could climb high enough to intercept B-29s cruising at 30,000 feet. By 1945, Japan had produced only 3,514 K-84s total, and many sat grounded for want of spare parts, fuel, or qualified pilots. Of those theoretically operational, perhaps half could be considered genuinely combat-ready at any moment. The fuel situation alone revealed the strategic catastrophe confronting Japan. While American pilots flew with 100-octane aviation gasoline shipped from Texas and California refineries, fuel specifically formulated for high-performance engines, Japanese pilots made do with whatever could be produced domestically or synthesized from coal. Late-war Japanese aviation fuel often tested at 87 octane or below, sometimes dropping to 80 octane, robbing engines of power and causing pre-ignition that destroyed cylinders and valves. Some desperate units supplemented their fuel with pine root oil extracted from tree stumps, alcohol distilled from sweet potatoes, and even sake production byproducts. Pilots reported engines that barely started, ran rough at all settings, and frequently failed catastrophically in flight.
On that inaugural April 7th mission, the Mustangs formed up with their charges. 103 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses from the 73rd Bomb Wing, each laden with tons of incendiary bombs destined for Japanese industrial targets. Captain Art Bridge of the 45th Fighter Squadron recalled the spectacle, the B-29s finishing their assembly in a grand circle as the fighters arrived, sunlight glinting off aluminum skin, appearing like a school of giant silver fish swimming through the sky. The rendezvous itself represented a triumph of navigation and planning impossible without American technological advantages. The P-51s had traversed 750 miles over featureless ocean, navigating primarily by dead reckoning and basic radio compass, timing their arrival to match the bomber's schedule within minutes.
They had climbed gradually from sea level to 25,000 feet, engines automatically adjusting mixture as they ascended, superchargers seamlessly transitioning from low to high boost to maintain power. Crossing the Honshu coast, P-51 pilots jettisoned and 110-gallon auxiliary wing tanks as they spotted the first head-on attacks from a force exceeding 100 Japanese interceptors scrambling from multiple airfields surrounding Tokyo. The silver drop tanks tumbled earthward, glinting in morning sun, some exploding on impact, others bouncing across rice paddies. Japanese pilots flying their mixed force K-84s, K-43s, K-44s, K-61s, and Navy fighters, including Zeros and the new N-1K2J Shiden Kai, experienced profound shock. These weren't Navy carrier fighters with limited radius, but land-based fighters that had somehow reached the homeland from impossibly distant bases. Flight Sergeant Tatani Midzu, flying a K-84 with the 56th Sentai, later recalled his disbelief. When scrambled, we were told enemy fighters were approaching Tokyo. We thought it was an error. Perhaps they meant bombers. When I saw the Mustangs with my own eyes, I thought I was dreaming. It was impossible. Our commanders had assured us no American fighter could reach Japan from their island bases. Yet there they were, dozens of them, flying as if they owned our sky. In that moment, I knew the war was truly lost. Major Tapp, destined to become an ace with 8 confirmed victories, was among the first Mustang pilots to tear into a Japanese formation. His combat report described the engagement with clinical precision. They came at us in the traditional 3-plane Shotai formation, but coordination was poor. The flight leader would commit to an attack, but wingmen often failed to follow. They seemed hesitant, perhaps low on fuel or ammunition, or simply inexperienced. We dove through them with a 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage, fired quick bursts, and zoom climbed back to altitude before they could react. This breakdown in Japanese tactical coordination reflected the crisis in pilot training that had reached catastrophic proportions. By 1945, most experienced Japanese pilots were dead, killed over the Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines, or in the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Replacements received as little as 50 hours of flight training before entering combat, compared to 600 hours American pilots accumulated before deploying to combat theaters. When the smoke cleared and the Mustangs returned to Iwo Jima, the Sunsetters of 7th Fighter Command were credited with 26 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 1 probable, and 5 damaged, at a cost of 2 P-51s and 1 pilot. The 13-to-1 kill ratio would only improve as American pilots gained experience over Japan, and Japanese pilot quality continued deteriorating. Within weeks, kill ratios of 20-to-1 or even 30-to-1 would become commonplace. The performance differential between these aircraft became starkly apparent in combat, particularly in the vertical dimension, where modern air combat increasingly occurred. The P-51D's superiority manifested especially above 20,000 feet, the altitude where most interceptions took place. At these heights, the Merlin engine's 2-stage supercharger maintained sea-level power while Japanese engines gasped. The first stage compressed thin air, cooled it through an intercooler, then fed it to the second stage for further compression, delivering dense, oxygen-rich air to the cylinders. The K-84's single-stage supercharger, lacking an intercooler and second compression stage, experienced dramatic power drop-off above 20,000 feet, reducing speed advantage and climb rate precisely where most interceptions occurred. At 30,000 feet, the K-84 could barely maintain 350 miles per hour, while the P-51D still achieved 420 miles per hour. Lieutenant Jerry Yellen of the 78th Fighter Squadron, who would fly the war's last combat mission on August 14, 1945, August 15th in Japan, described a typical engagement. We'd spot them climbing to meet us, leaving dark exhaust trails as they firewalled throttles. But by 25,000 feet, they were wallowing like fish out of water. Their engines smoked, probably running too rich because superchargers couldn't provide enough air. We'd dive through their formation with our 50s blazing, tracers looking like laser beams, and they simply couldn't match our speed in the dive or our zoom climb afterward. Our Merlin would sing as we pulled up, G-forces crushing us into seats, while their radios coughed and sputtered, struggling to maintain power. The P-51D could dive at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour while maintaining control authority, its laminar flow wings remaining effective even approaching transonic speeds. Japanese fighters often experienced control reversal or structural failure above 400 miles per hour in a dive, control surfaces blanking out or wings simply tearing off. The contrast in pilot quality proved devastating and worsened daily. American pilots arriving at Iwo Jima typically logged 400 to 600 flight hours, including 100-plus hours in type, dozens of hours of gunnery practice, and extensive combat training against experienced instructors flying captured enemy aircraft. They had practiced formation flying until it became second nature, instrument navigation in all weather, deflection shooting at towed targets, and combat tactics developed from 3 years of warfare experience. Japanese pilots in 1945 often had less than 100 total hours, sometimes as little as 30 hours, with minimal gunnery practice due to ammunition shortages, no instrument training, and combat tactics learned from manuals rather than experienced instructors who were all dead or flying combat themselves. The navigation challenge alone separated the capable from the doomed. Flying single-engine fighters on 1,500-mile round trips over vast ocean with minimal navigation aids required confidence born of experience and trust in both machine and support systems. American pilots flew with detailed weather briefings compiled from submarine weather reports and reconnaissance flights, accurate maps updated from photo reconnaissance, and functioning instruments manufactured to precise specifications. They had rescue submarines stationed along their route, lifeguard submarines that saved dozens of downed airmen, and could rely on PBY Catalina flying boats to rescue them if forced down. Japanese pilots increasingly flew with outdated maps that didn't show recent bomb damage, unreliable compasses that hadn't been properly calibrated, and no hope of rescue if downed over water. Their life rafts, if they possessed them at all, often leaked, and emergency rations had usually been consumed during food shortages on the ground. The magnetic variation between Iwo Jima and Tokyo in 1945 was 3 degrees west, since Tokyo lay between the 139th and 140th meridians, while Iwo Jima sat between the 141st and 142nd. Navigation simplified to basic compass headings for the return flight, a fortunate geographic coincidence that saved countless American lives. When weather deteriorated or pilots became disoriented in combat, they could simply fly south-southeast and eventually sight Iwo Jima's distinctive Mount Suribachi rising from the ocean, assuming sufficient fuel remained. The logistics supporting each force revealed the true nature of the Pacific Air War, a contest between American abundance and Japanese scarcity. Every Iwo Jima mission involved nearly 100 Mustangs consuming 57,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and carrying 230,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, plus bombs and rockets for ground attack. This represented merely 1 day's operations from one base, and 3 fighter groups operated from Iwo Jima alone.
Behind this stood a supply chain stretching to Detroit factories, Texas refineries, and Missouri ammunition plants, all connected by Liberty ships produced at 3 per day and C-54 Skymaster transport aircraft flying regular Pacific cargo routes. Ships arrived at Iwo Jima daily, unloading fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, mail, and the 1,000 items needed to keep a modern air force operational. Meanwhile, Japanese logistics had collapsed into chaos. Aviation fuel was so scarce that training flights were canceled, leaving new pilots to face combat with no recent flying experience. Ammunition was rationed even for combat missions, with pilots instructed to conserve rounds for only the most certain shots. The Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, never well coordinated even in the best times, now competed desperately for dwindling resources. Aircraft were cannibalized for spare parts until nothing remained but aluminum skeletons, and entire fighter groups sat grounded for lack of tires, spark plugs, or hydraulic fluid.
The technological sophistication gap extended beyond aircraft to every operational aspect. American pilots wore G-suits, preventing blackouts in high-G maneuvers by squeezing blood back to the brain, used standardized oxygen systems functioning reliably above 30,000 feet with automatic flow regulation, and communicated via VHF radios with clear reception and multiple channels. Their parachutes received regular inspection and repacking. Life rafts contained working radios and fresh supplies, and survival kits included everything from morphine to fishing gear. Japanese pilots often flew without functioning radios. Vacuum tube radios consumed precious battery power and rarely worked properly. They used unreliable oxygen systems that frequently failed above 20,000 feet, causing hypoxia and disorientation, and had no G-suits, limiting their ability to match American aggressive maneuvering without blacking out. On June 1, 1945, called Black Friday by the Mustang men, weather rather than enemy action proved the greatest threat. About 150 Mustangs en route to Osaka flew into a massive frontal system that weather forecasts hadn't predicted. 27 aircraft were lost in minutes, with 24 losses attributed to weather, pilots becoming disoriented in towering cumulus clouds, flying into each other, or simply running out of fuel while seeking clear air. The weather front extended from sea level to 40,000 feet with violent turbulence, icing conditions, and zero visibility. Pilots reported St. Elmo's fire dancing on wings, compasses spinning uselessly, and artificial horizons tumbling as gyroscopes failed to process the violent motion. The impact on Japanese morale was catastrophic. Captain Yoshio Yoshida, a Ki-84 pilot with the 47th Sentai who survived the war, wrote in his diary, "The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo has shattered our confidence completely. We were told the B-29s were vulnerable without escort, that their fighters could never reach so far. Now we see Mustangs over the palace itself, strafing our airfields in broad daylight, shooting down our best pilots as if they were beginners. How can we defend the Emperor when the enemy's fighters roam freely over the sacred homeland? The sight of those Mustangs, so confident, so numerous, tells us what our leaders will not. The war is lost, and we are simply waiting to die." The Sunsetter's last aerial combat occurred near Tokyo on August 10, 1945, when the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups claimed 7 kills in what would be among the final air battles of World War II. By this point, Japanese resistance had become almost token, a shadow of the force that once swept across the Pacific. Fuel shortages meant most Japanese fighters sat grounded, their tanks drained to provide fuel for kamikaze aircraft. Those that did fly were often piloted by teenagers with minimal training, boys who had been in high school mere months before.
In total, Iwo Jima's Mustangs were credited with 206 Japanese aircraft shot down between April and August 1945, 75% of all Pacific P-51 aerial victories. The actual number was probably higher, as many Japanese aircraft shot down over Japan were never confirmed, their wreckage lost in forests or urban areas. The strategic impact extended beyond aerial victories to reshape the entire Pacific War. The presence of P-51s over Japan meant B-29s could bomb in daylight with greater accuracy, systematically destroying Japan's industrial infrastructure. The psychological effect proved equally devastating. Japanese civilians witnessed American fighters strafing airfields in broad daylight, attacking trains, assaulting shipping in Tokyo Bay, making clear that Japan had lost control of its own airspace. The industrial mathematics were irrefutable. The United States produced 15,586 P-51s of all variants during the war, more than Japan's total aircraft production of all types in 1944 and 1945 combined. Japan managed approximately 3,500 K-84s, but many were destroyed on the ground by B-29 raids and carrier strikes, lost in training accidents due to poor quality control, or grounded for lack of parts. American production lines hit their stride as Japanese production collapsed. North American aviation alone produced 20 P-51s per day at peak production, more than Japan produced K-84s in a month. By August 1945, Japan had less than 200,000 gallons of aviation fuel remaining in the home islands, enough for perhaps one major operation. The technological revolution represented by the P-51D embodied an entire philosophy of warfare: mass production with quality control, standardization across manufacturers, and continuous improvement based on combat feedback. Brigadier General Ernest M. Moore, commander of 7th Fighter Command, later wrote, "I don't believe there is any question about the P-51 being the best prop fighter of World War II. It was our top air superiority fighter, and hence best for escort missions, and equal to the P-47 as an attacker against ground targets." The P-51D Mustang over Mount Fuji was more than an aircraft. It was the embodiment of American industrial supremacy, technological innovation, and the inexorable mathematics of total war. The lesson was clear and brutal. In modern industrial warfare, superior technology multiplied by massive production equals victory. The shock of American fighters over Tokyo was ultimately the shock of mathematical reality, a reality that ended with atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, delivered by B-29s that no longer needed fighter escort because Japanese air power had ceased to exist. The Mustangs had completed their mission with ruthless efficiency. They had proven that distance provided no defense, that industrial might trumped warrior spirit, and that technological superiority, properly applied, was insurmountable. Of 3,514 K-84s built, only one survives today, resting in the Chiron Peace Museum in Kagoshima, Japan, a solitary reminder of Japan's desperate attempt to match American technological superiority. Meanwhile, hundreds of P-51 Mustangs survive in museums and private collections worldwide, many still flying at air shows, their Merlin engines singing the song of American industrial triumph 8 decades after they first appeared in the skies over Tokyo. The age of the samurai had ended, replaced by the age of the production line, the supercharger, and the very long-range fighter escort. The divine wind had been conquered by science, the warrior spirit broken by industrial might, and the empire of the rising sun overshadowed by wings of aluminum and engines of steel.